Do you know, it occurred to me fairly recently that next year will be the 20th anniversary of the debut of the BBC's Life on Mars. 20 years since Sam Tyler questioned whether he was in a coma, dead, or travelled back in time. Let's look at the very first episode of Life on Mars, and I will tell you my first impressions. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. If you're new here, like and subscribe to the channel, please. That's the thing to do. Loads of cult and retro stuff here, plus a smattering of modern films and things, a lot of Doctor Who, physical media, all that sort of guff. It's all here on this channel, so press that subscribe button, press that like, leave a comment down below, plus share and tell your friends. Life on Mars then debuted on the 9th of January 2006. This was a vaguely exciting time for British television, which had been quite moribund in the early part of the 20th century. Reality television had put TV in a chokehold, and there wasn't much in the way of exciting, innovative drama. Doctor Who had come back in 2005 and sort of kicked things into life a little bit. Of course, that ultimately led to things like Torchwood, Sarah Jane Adventures, and Doctor Who itself led to things like Robin Hood, Merlin, and Atlantis. There was suddenly this new thirst for fantasy adventure, if you like, or stories that weren't modern world type dramas, which I think British drama had drifted into a bit, and they certainly have these days. Life on Mars ostensibly is a police series, a detective series, and that's one thing which is almost anathema to me. I've got nothing against detective series. I can always watch a Sherlock Holmes story because Sherlock Holmes is a bit of a superhero. He's unusual, he's eccentric and quirky, and he operates outside the boundaries of normal detectives, and I always find that sort of thing fascinating. But British TV has always been fascinated by detectives and murders and mysteries, and sort of stuff doesn't really engage me. I'm not really interested in finding out who killed a random person in an episode of a drama that we don't know. They were killed by somebody we don't know, and then we move on to another murder the following week or the following series. Not interested in the private lives of tortured detectives who are trying to balance their home lives and their professional lives, or they're going through a divorce, they got problems with their kids, or they got drink problems. Don't care, not interested. And I'm sure many of these shows are really very good and very interesting if you like that sort of stuff, but I haven't got enough time left in my life to watch another murder mystery, another detective show. So, in a sense, Life on Mars was a show that I wouldn't really have been interested in. But, of course, the central conceit of it drew me in, and it is a fascinating concept that was really well put together. Before I talk about the first episode, which I rewatched yesterday on my DVD box set of Life on Mars, which I haven't looked at for years, a little bit about the history of the show. Life on Mars was actually conceived and created back in the late 1990s. Matthew Graham and Ashley Farrow, they were dispatched by the production company Kudos to come up with some new ideas for new dramas that could be pitched to British TV networks, particularly the BBC. They came up with an idea for a series called Ford Granada. This was going to be a sort of a wry look back at 1970s cop shows, things like The Sweeney, which I think it's fair to say is reflected quite well in Life on Mars itself. The idea of the macho, no-nonsense, hard-drinking, womanising 1970s cop who didn't play by the rules but got results. Sweeney was hugely popular in the 1970s, and I suppose it was ripe for a revisionist reimagining. The idea of Ford Granada's series was pitched to the BBC, who turned it down flat. As Matthew Graham, the co-creator, stated sometime later, at this time, networks were very jittery about anything that wasn't real world. Anything with a vague fantasy, science fiction edge, they would not touch, because that was felt not to be a popular genre. Science fiction and fantasy had been hugely popular in the UK in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. But things had changed, possibly because Hollywood had made people's expectations of what that sort of thing would be difficult to achieve on BBC budgets. Doctor Who's dying days had been bedeviled by low budgets and poor special effects and declining viewer interest. And I think that more than anything else had turned the whole of British television against the idea of doing anything in that genre, because it's too expensive and it didn't bring in the audiences. There's always been this thing in the UK from British viewers that it's far-fetched, or it's hokum, or it's unbelievable. British TV audiences aren't hugely imaginative in that regard. They will occasionally stumble across something which they quite like, but they move away from it quite quickly. I'm thinking of things like when The X-Files became a huge hit in the 90s. It was briefly massively popular in the UK. For 2 or 3 series, it was like the buzz, and then people just lost interest. And unfortunately, that's what happens in the UK, probably because we've not been given this sort of stuff. People aren't exposed to it, so when it comes along, they're wary of it. And because of that, commissioners are wary of it, because they think that people don't like it. It's a sort of a vicious circle, really. You don't make it because people don't like it. People don't see it, so they don't get to like it. So the commissioners don't make it. So it is a frustrating, vicious circle. So with the show rejected by the BBC, it went to Channel 4, where John York, who was the drama executive at the time, he redeveloped the idea, and he wanted to create a sort of a double act, a comedy double act between the characters of Sam Tyler and the legendary Gene Hunt. Channel 4 eventually, however, abandoned the idea because they felt it was going to be a bit silly. Ultimately, though, the tide turned in Life on Mars's favour. It came to the attention of Julie Gardner at the BBC. She was at the time a bigwig at BBC Wales. She persuaded Jane Tranter, head of drama at the BBC, to take a punt on the show and commission it. And of course, Jane Tranter and Julie Gardner and other bigwigs at Bad Wolf, who make Doctor Who. So they obviously had a shared interest in slightly left field drama with a slight fantasy edge. So Matthew Graham set about rewriting that first script into a new drama for the BBC. The show was cast and went into production, and the first episode aired on the 9th of January 2006. And as I said, I watched that episode yesterday as a refresher because I've not seen it for a long time. And I was immediately, once again, drawn into this really interesting scenario, which suggests time travel, also is extremely police procedural, but has elements of a mystery about it, psychological thriller about it. It mixes all this stuff together to create something quite unique and quite unusual. It starts off with John Sim, who plays Sam Tyler. John Sim at the time was quite a young, thrusting, angry young man, I think. A bit like Christopher Eccleston, who was cast in Doctor Who. They were unusual castings for this sort of project. They were sort of very gritty northern actors, very much interested in realism and focusing on the modern world and working class ethics and stuff like that. So it was unusual to see these two men take on these roles. And interestingly, Sam Tyler's character has a very similar look to Christopher Eccleston's Doctor Who, with the leather jacket and boots and black jeans. It's quite a similar look. Probably coincidental, but there is a similar look, and I think that's quite interesting. Sam Tyler's character was originally Sam Williams. Matthew Graham was asked to come up with a slightly more interesting surname, and he asked his daughter for a surname, and she had been watching Doctor Who, and she suggested Tyler, based of course on Rose Tyler, Billie Piper's character. I don't know how familiar Matthew Graham was of Doctor Who at the time where he made that connection. You would think that as a writer you might have thought, well, actually, that's already in use in a very popular show, I won't go there. But he proceeded to call the character Sam Tyler, and nobody at the BBC made a fuss about that. Perhaps they thought it would work to Life on Mars's benefit to have the sort of subliminal connection with Doctor Who. But the first episode starts with John Sim as Sam Tyler. He's a DCI with the Greater Manchester Police, and he's investigating a murder of a young girl. And the beginning of the episode, we find him on the run chasing a suspect who gets brought into custody, but it soon becomes apparent that this particular suspect couldn't have been where he was supposed to have been at the time of the murder. Sam appears to have been having a relationship with one of his colleagues, Maya, played by Archie Punjabi. He stands her down from the investigation because of their personal connection. She goes out on a limb, however, and gets into her own investigation. She rings up Sam to tell him that she's on pursuit of a suspect, and suddenly she's cut off. The police hurry to the scene of where she sent her message, and they find her bloodied blouse hanging over the seat of a swing. He realises that Maya has at best been abducted. He's devastated, of course. He's mortified. He can't think what to do next. He's driving back to the station. He stops at the side of the road, steps out of the car just to get a breath of fresh air. Car comes the other direction and sends him flying across the street. We see him sort of lying and twitching and semi-conscious, and all of a sudden we hear voices calling to him, medical voices. We hear the beep of medical equipment. He's in hospital, he's in a coma, he's unconscious, but he hears voices calling out to him. Suddenly he wakes up, and he's on a piece of waste ground near a car that isn't his. He's approached by a policeman to find out who he is, what he's doing there. And Sam slowly realises that things are slightly different. He wants his mobile. The officer doesn't know what a mobile is. Your mobile what? Things are very different. He makes his way back to police headquarters, which is the same building, but now it's the Manchester and Salford Police. And he goes into his office and everything's different. Whereas his office had been pristine and gleaming and full of computers and people busily wandering around, here it's a dingy, smoky environment filled with slightly sleazy looking police officers, all wandering around looking at him with distrust. It's a totally different environment. It's his office. He recognises the shape and form of it, but nothing that he recognises is there. His computer isn't there. I think he says at one point, where's my PC? Of course, they don't think of a computer, they think of a police constable. You want a police constable? Then he meets up with the formidable Gene Hunt, played by Philip Glenister, the legendary Gene Hunt, whose reputation stretched far beyond life on Mars. It turns out that wherever Sam is now, he is a detective inspector rather than a detective chief inspector, and Gene Hunt is his boss. The two clash. Gene Hunt is the Regan type character, I suppose, from the Sweeney. He's slobbish and boorish, and as they all are in this environment, they're all sexist and racist and homophobic, and they come up with all these extraordinary comments that you wouldn't get away with in any other context. But this is reflecting a period in time. Sam appears to be in 1973. Something's happened. He is in a 1973 environment. He has to deal with that, and he has to come to terms with a different world, as well as trying to find out what has happened to him. Where is he? Has he travelled back in time? Is it all in his head? All through the episode, we hear voices, distant voices talking to him, encouraging him, calling to him. We hear the beeps of machines. We're clearly told at this point that he is in a coma, he is in hospital, and yet he is living in this 3D environment of 1973, trying to come to terms with all the prejudices and all the weirdness of 1973. And in doing so, he becomes involved in police investigations. In this first episode, he's involved in an investigation into a murder of local girls. This reflects what he was investigating in 2006. And there are ties and connections to what's happening in 1973, to what happens in 2006. He doesn't know what's happened to Maya, but he's hearing these voices and strange visions. It's a very strong first episode that really sets out the show's format and sets out the show's ongoing mysteries, whilst appearing to offer the solution. The answer appears to be there in front of us. He's in a coma, he's imagining all this. And yet it does pose the question, would your coma mind create such a vivid world where everything is so vivid, the characters are so vivid, everything has context and form and shape? He's living in this slightly grotty flat. He forms an attachment with Annie Cartwright, who's WPC, who sympathises with him. She sort of hears what he says. He tells her that he's from the future, and she rationalises that he's obviously suffering from concussion. There's a problem that he needs to address, and he ultimately decides and realises that the only way he can get back to his time is by jumping off the roof of the building at the end of the episode. He climbs up to the top of the building and he thinks, yeah, I've got to take this final step to go back to where I come from. The only way is to die in this world. He doesn't do that, of course. She brings him back from the brink. That's like sort of a cliffhanger ending. It's a very, very strong first episode. I'd forgotten just how gritty it is and how clever the script is. It's a really clever script. I mean, Gene Hunt, throughout the series, came up with some classic one-liners. I mean, just in this episode, we get the scene where he meets Sam Tyler for the first time, and he just grabs him and pushes him up against the filing cabinets, and Sam Tyler wants to know where he is, what year it is. It's 1973, it's dinner time, I'm having oops. And this is Gene Hunt's way of talking, and it is so 1970s. I think it was criticised at the time by people who were in the police in the 70s and said, it wasn't like that, it really wasn't like that. But I think the idea is that what Sam is experiencing reflects what he has seen in TV programmes that reflected the 1970s. Not the real 1970s, but his memories of seeing things like The Sweeney and Special Branch and all those cop shows that depicted a very different world and a very different type of policing. What's interesting as well, watching it, is you can see a bond of mutual admiration building up between Sam Tyler and Gene Hunt, because Sam is used to a world of forensics and computers and getting test results in a day rather than 2 weeks. And he tries to bring his knowledge of that to the 1970s. And there's a culture clash between the police in the 70s and the laid-back way they did things and the way they didn't take forensics and evidence gathering and statement gathering in anything like the way it's done today, where it's much more formalised and much better organised. You look back to this and whether it reflects real policing in the 70s or not. Things were quite sloppy back then. From my own slightly distant perspective, I used to be a lawyer and I know the ways that these things come together now, and that statements are taken and the disclosure of evidence and all these things that weren't done back then. And I have worked on crime reconstruction things for television about miscarriages of justice and some of the things that did happen with evidence not being disclosed. One particular drama that I did a couple of years ago about this guy who was stitched up for a crime he couldn't have committed. The police knew he couldn't have committed it, but they lost an important piece of evidence that would have completely exonerated him, and as a result he spent a considerable period in prison. So I think although it's easy to say it wasn't like that in the 70s, I think it was a bit like this. It does reflect a certain sloppiness because these were the early days of sort of fingerprint technology and forensics and so on. Things were done differently then. And I think that this first episode really shows that. Sam Tyler, the sophisticated 21st century cop, versus these hard drinking, hard smoking Neanderthals from the 70s. But it's a really good drama in itself. It has a mystery that is a mirror image of the one that Sam was investigating in 2006. And again, is that his subconscious replaying the same story but involving him in it in a deeper way? At this point, we don't really know. It's a very good first episode. It's a science fiction, thriller, police, procedural. It mixes all this stuff up in a way that makes it palatable to all the audiences. And I think that's often a problem with some science fiction shows that are science fiction but pretend they're not. They're sometimes not one thing or the other. They're a drama or they're science fiction. Certainly in British television, it's very hard to reconcile the two because commissioners are frightened of science fiction. They don't want to frighten off the general audience, but then they alienate the science fiction audience by pussyfooting around the fantasy stuff. But it's a very good and very strong first episode, and it's not surprising that the show was a huge success, and it was a real buzz about it at the time. I remember in work, people talking about this great show, and it was really clever, and trying to theorise what had happened to Sam, what really was going on. The show establishes itself even more in the second episode. I'm not going to talk about the second episode because this is first impressions, but hopefully you will remember that title sequence and the theme music, which was clearly created to evoke the feel of 1960s adventure shows because you have the cast shown in close-ups, those sort of dramatic images of them and their names coming up, and this driving music, which is very much like the music you had on those shows in the 60s and 70s. There's a very clear attempt to recreate that feel for this show, and it works brilliantly because I remember watching every episode and thinking this is a really exciting start. And even though many of the stories in the subsequent series were fairly standard police stories of kidnapping and murder and blackmail and so on, there was always this element of Sam being the man at a time. There was always that edge to it. Hugely successful show, which only ran for 2 8-part series, as you may recall. I think that now it is stated that they felt that they wanted to wrap the story up after 2 seasons, but I know at the time they were planning a 3rd season, but John Sim didn't want to become typecast. He didn't want to be stuck in one role. He didn't want to spend 6 months of the year filming the same show. So he walked. I think John Sim as an actor has softened a bit over the years. He now plays a character called Grace in one of those detective shows that I mentioned earlier, which is a returning drama now for ITV. It's in its 5th series. So he clearly isn't too worried now about being typecast. But now he's an older actor with a big body of work behind him. I think when Life on Mars came on, he was still early 30s and wanted to do a variety of different things. And of course, just a few years later, he time travelled properly when he took on the role of the Master in several episodes of Doctor Who with David Tennant and later with Peter Capaldi. He was, for me, the best of the new Masters. I like Sacha Dhawan, who's played the role most recently. I won't talk about Michelle Gomez's Missy because, I won't. But I think John Sim brought a real manic energy to the Master, and I think a lot of Doctor Who fans railed against it because they felt he was just a psychopath. But at the time, David Tennant was the Doctor, and he was this ball of fizzing energy. I think John Sim played the Master as the reverse of that, the flip side of that, the evil side of a David Tennant characterisation of the Doctor. But that's by the by. So Life on Mars ran for 2 years, very successful. It wrapped up to an extent, but it was such a good idea that it continued for 3 series with Keeley Hawes cast as a cop who finds herself in the 1980s, where Gene Hunt and his sidekicks are now in London. And it continued the conceit of this idea of this woman out of time, this woman from the modern day who's suddenly faced with Gene Hunt and all his faults and failings. Wasn't as good a series, I think, because the idea had been done. It was very popular, and it did, in fact, the final episode resolved the entire situation in relation to Sam Tyler as well. And I think it was quite a neat twist when we discover who Gene Hunt actually is and actually was, and his purpose. And it was quite a clever, quite a dark and cerebral ending to the franchise, as it were. And in fact, as a coder, a couple of years back, Matthew Graham, I think, and Ashley Farrow decided to resurrect the idea for a 4-part mini-series for the BBC, which was to be called Lazarus. You'll have noticed, of course, Life on Mars, Ashes to Ashes, and Lazarus, all David Bowie song titles. And in fact, in that very first episode of Life on Mars, that's the song that's playing on Sam Tyler's iPod. Remember them? When he's knocked over, which is, again, is the reflection of part of his fantasy world. Lazarus was, I think the first script was written for Lazarus. Apparently it was a very good script which explained how they go back into this world. There was a table read for it. BBC passed on it for reasons of cost, which is a problem we're hearing again and again about TV these days. So that's Life on Mars, first episode. There are no titles to the Life on Mars episodes, but it is a terrific piece of drama that stands up actually very well, mainly because it's sort of set in a different era. But it's very impressive that they managed to recreate 1970s Manchester in 2006 Manchester. And there are some quite lavish street scenes full of extras and full of cars. So it clearly wasn't a cheap show to make, despite the fact there were no fizzy visuals. The money must have gone on making sure the 1970s Manchester looked like 1970s Manchester. And although I didn't live in Manchester in the 1970s, I can imagine it looked the way it looks in Life on Mars. It's a great series. If you've never seen it, you must watch it. You can still pick up the DVD extremely cheaply. There's also a Blu-ray edition, but the show wasn't filmed in high definition, so what you get on the Blu-ray is an upscale, which I'm told isn't brilliant, but presumably a bit of a step up from the DVD. But I watched it on the projector yesterday, and it looks perfectly fine. It has a grit and grain about it, which I think is appropriate for this particular type of show in this scenario. Highly recommended if you've never seen Life on Mars. That's the first episode, which I watched again, and I'm going to give that first episode 9 out of 10 because I thought it was terrifically entertaining and really absorbing. Very clever. Right, thank you for watching this episode of First Impressions. The next episode in this particular run is going to be Arrival, the very first episode of The Prisoner from 1967. The Prisoner, of course, is probably one of the most written about and talked about fantasy shows of all time. But I'm going to be talking about that first episode in the next First Impressions, which will be around sometime next week. So once again, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like, please subscribe. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.